Should we catch up the whole week now, or should? Amazing. Good morning. We begin today's daf, Avoda Zara daf Nandala, by thanking our sponsors. We thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tulsin family, for sponsoring all the Shurmas, is Chutz for Basuras Tavas for Am Yisrael. We also thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachem Av, Stephen and Wendy Drazen in honor of Israel Drazen, Dina Drazen, Stanley Rosenzweig, Zechron Levracha, and Eileen Rosenzweig. Hashem, everyone should be zeichet to Areyeh Yomi, V'shalom Tech Brias Nefesh Brias Aguf, and the Neshama should have an Aliyah. Family should have a Nechama. Today's daf again is daf Nandal. We're picking up on daf Nandal 54a. 4 lines in, last word on the line. Tana, we learned. Nevad shalo asar. If something was served as avodah zara and it belongs to him, it becomes prohibited. B'shel chavero. If a person serves avodah zara, an item belonging to his friend, mutter, the item remains permissible. Gemara says, hold on a second. Again, the simple logic behind that would be, is that a person has the ability to take control of their own items, but not to ruin things that don't belong to them. Therefore, if I own an item, and another person decides he wants to serve that item as an avodah zara, that's his problem, but not my problem. He cannot turn my item into forbidden material just because he served it. It's mine, not his. The problem just is, the Gemara says, V'ramini, that seems to be a contradiction to something we learned someplace else. It says, Ezeu nevad. There's a brayso that says, Ezeu nevad. What is a case of something which was served by avodah zara? Kol she'ovdin osan. Anything that was served. And the brayso goes ahead and articulates, explains, it lists off. Bein b'shogig, whether it was by mistake. Bein b'mezid, whether it was on purpose. Bein b'onis, whether it was done in a way where there's no other choice. It just seems like it was totally out of control. Bein b'ratzon, whether it was with willingness. So now exactly what the difference between mezid and ratzon is, there probably isn't any difference. But I think I saw somewhere there's no difference. Yeah, Rashi says it. I knew it was someplace very clear. Rashi in the last line, Mezid v'ratzon chadahi, elatana ratzon eitzel onis. In other words, there's often that contrast that's written. Whenever you're going to say, in every case it's going to be a problem, there's that language that comes out, which is bein b'shogi, bein b'mezid, bein b'onis, bein b'ratzon. But ultimately, the bottom line is, there's no difference between a person serving avodah zara b'mezid and b'ratzon. Mezid means with intention, ratzon means willingness. It's exactly the same thing. Now the Gemara wants to know, Hai ones hechidami. What does it mean a person served avodah zara b'ones? What's the ones? What's the case over here? Typically, what's an ones? So an ones is an unpreventable circumstance, something that I could not have, there was nothing I could have done to prevent this thing from happening. That's a typical ones. So the Gemara wants to know what's it talking about in this case. Lav kagon, why can't we assume that it's talking about a case, for example, the onas behemas chavero, a person forced another person's animal to be their avodah zara. Vishtachvala. So a guy's walking down the block and he sees another person's animal. He's like, oh, this animal's got to be an avodah zara. He goes ahead, he pulls the animal aside, and he starts doing whatever service he wants to that. He starts bowing down to the animal. So what do you see from there? A person serves someone else's animal, and it becomes usher. Why is that considered ones? Because it's my animal. I have nothing to do with this. My animal's minding its own business, doing animal stuff wherever it's supposed to be, and some random guy comes over and starts bowing down to my animal. That's an ones. It's an unpreventable circumstance, because I, as the owner of the animal, had nothing I could have done about it. So therefore, it's considered to be an ones. Still, it seems to say very clearly, this is in the category of nevat, and this would be forbidden. Amar Rami Bar Chama, lo, incorrect. That's not the case of ones. Rather, kagon she'ansuhu ovdei kochavim v'ishtachavel lebehem todi day. What's it talking about? So, ovdei kochavim, idol worshippers came by, and they saw a yid, and they said, Mr. Yid, your animal is an avodah zara, and we are forcing you to go ahead and bow down to your own animal. That's the case where it becomes usher. So again, we initially stated that a person's animal does not become usher if someone else bows down to it. We had a problem that the Brisa lists off a case of ones, which seems to indicate that if someone else bows down to a Jew's animal, the animal becomes forbidden. And the Gemara said, no, that's not the case. The case is talking about where a person was forced by an akum to bow down to his own animal, and in such a case like that, that's where it's going to be the problem. The Gemara says, hold on, that's the problem? Where an akum forced a Yisrael to bow down to his own animal, and that's where the animal becomes a problem of Nevad, of Avoda Zara, Maskef Rabbi Zara, Onus Rachmana Patre. When a person is forced to do something, the Torah always tells us that he's exempt. We don't hold a person responsible for things that they can't control. So someone goes ahead and forces someone to bow down to the animal. Now the animal is going to go ahead and become usher. It's an ones. The guy had nothing. He couldn't do anything about it. His life was at stake. How do I know that? The chsiv, for it says in the pasuk, "V'lanara lo sa'asa davar," referring to a case where a woman was violated against her will. Pasuk says to this young lady, Rahman al-Islam, who was violated against her will, Lanara lotasa davar. Nothing shall be done to this young lady. And it's interesting that the Torah actually gives an example. It says, Lanara lotasa davar, to this young lady, nothing shall be done. Ein lanara chet, this young girl, this is not in the Gemara, this is just the pasuk. This young girl has no sin on her hands. Ein lanara chet maves, ki kasher yakum ish Areyeh rutzacho, kena davar azeh. Just like if a person is the victim of murder, this is exactly the same thing. If a person is the victim of a violation against their will, they're like a murder victim. What are they supposed to do about it? Someone forced them into this type of thing. There's no Avera over here. So we know from here the concept that Ones Rachmana Patre, when a person is in a state of ones, unpreventable circumstance, the Torah does not hold them responsible for it. So therefore, why is it that in our case, if an akum goes ahead and forces a Jew to bow down to his own animal, that he's going to be responsible for it? This should be a simple case of ones, just like a young girl who's violated. The Torah tells us very clearly she's not responsible for anything to do with that. This Jew should not be held responsible for anything to do with the Avoda Zara, and his animal should not become forbidden. The Gemara says, El Amar Rava, Hakol Hayu Bechlal Lo Sa'avdim. He darshans a number of psukim over here. When the Torah initially said, Lo Sa'avdim, don't serve Avoda Zara, then everyone was included. Ukishaparat Lacha Akasav, when the Torah went ahead and wrote V'chai Bohem, so V'chai Bohem is a pasuk which ultimately tells us that all the mitzvahs that Kadosh Baruch Hu gave us are given for us to live by. So then, Veloshi Yamos Behen, we now know that a person's never supposed to give up their life to be able to, say it a little differently. A person's not obligated to give up their life to serve a mitzvah. So therefore, Yatsa Onis, it was taken a case of an Onis where a person is forced into doing something, that case was excluded. When it came to Avoda Zara, there's a reiteration of the pasuk of Lo Sechalu Hashem Kachi Dafilu Ba'onis. So it tells us even in the case of onis, there's a problem with Chilul Hashem. That's why the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos tells us Echad Onis V'Echad Shogig V'Chilul Hashem. When it comes to Chilul Hashem, there really is no exemption of onis. So the Gemara is essentially saying the following: you're right. Typically, we know there's a concept called Onus Rachmana Patre. Whenever a person is in a circumstance where it is an unpreventable circumstance, they're not held responsible for it. However, when it comes to Chilul Hashem, which Avoda Zara is the paradigmatic example of Chilul Hashem, it is the greatest desecration of Hashem's name for a person to go ahead and serve idols. Idol worship is a Chilul Hashem. So therefore, what's happening over here is we have the initial Avoda Zara, which includes everybody. V'chai bohem excludes ones, and then Lo Sechalu Hashem Kachi seems to go ahead and include ones again when it comes to Chilul Hashem. So we have a problem over here. In one place, ones is excluded. Another place, ones, an unpreventable circumstance, is included. So how does this work? The Gemara answers, Habatzina, Habafarhesi. It depends what's going on here. If it's going on in private means when there's less than 10 people over there, that's the case where a person is not obligated to give up their life for. A person is not obligated to fight the ones. However, Farhasi, when it comes to a public desecration of Kadosh Baruch Hu's name, for a person to serve Avoda Zara in public, in such a case like that, there is no heter of ba'ones. A person is not allowed to serve Avoda Zara ba'ones. That's what our brisa meant when it said echad ones. Even if a person's forced to go ahead and serve Avoda Zara, it's still a problem. They're not allowed to do it. And if they are going to do it, their animal is going to become forbidden if it was done in public. But of course, if it was done in private, that would be a case where the Chai Bohem would tell you that a person should not fight it, and rather they're not obligated to give up their life. Amru le Rabbanan le Rava. The Rabbanan wants to go ahead and bring a riot to Rava. Again, Rava is the one who just told us the difference between public and private. So Amru le Rabbanan le Rava tani misaylach. We have a brisa which backs up what you are telling us. It says, "Bimosio shel avdu kochavim b'shas hagzera, afal pisha hagzera b'tela, osam bimosios lo batlu." So we had this bimosios yesterday. These are these pedestals that were used to serve Avodah Zara. So at the times of Gezerah, now you'll notice in some of the Gemara's mine has little bays over there, and it tells us that really it wasn't B'shas HaGzerah, it was B'shas HaShmad. They took out the words B'shas HaShmad because the censor didn't like it, so they took out the Shmad. In other words, these were times when people were being recruited to Avodah Zara. So at times of a mass public recruiting towards Avodah Zara, that's when things are much more strict, and that's when we lay down the law. So we said these bimosios of Avodah Zara, these pedestals that are used for Avodah Zara, in times of public shmad, even though the gezerah goes away, those pedestals remain aser. So Amar lahu, imi shum halo tasayim. If that's what you're going to bring a raya from, that's not a raya, because Amar Yisrael mumar have upalach labarasa. In other words, those things, since there were so many people going ahead and serving Avodah Zara under those times, it was such a major chilul Hashem. You know why those became aser? It's not because it was in public. Rather, the issue is because Amar, it's possible. So Amar Yisrael mumar havi. There must have been at least one Jew who didn't really care. He was a mummer. He was not concerned about keeping mitzvahs. He was an Avodah Zara, and he went to Hedu Palachla, Baratzon. He bowed down to it, Baratzon. In other words, B'shas Hashmad, typically you assume that most people have no choice, and they're bowing down to Avodah Zara because they have no choice. They were forced to do it. Now, you're assuming that's going to be an ones, and you're assuming that every single person did it ba'ones. Now you're trying to prove, well, you know what, even though it was ba'ones, it was in public, that's going to be a problem. Well, you know what, no, that's not a riot. Because it might be that the reason why it becomes aser is not because it was done in public, like you just got finished saying. Rather, the reason why it became aser, because it was served ba'ones, is because there were some people who did not serve it ba'ones. There were some people who probably went ahead and said, you know what, let's join the club, let's have a good time. Rav Ashi Amar La, Lo Tema Amar, don't say maybe there were some Jews who may have been Yisrael Mumar who went ahead and served the Avodah Zara willingly. Ela Vadai Yisrael Mumar Havi Upalach La Baratz. And there definitely were some Yisrael Mumar. Rahman al-San, this is just the reality. The reality is that every time they had these Gzeres Hashmad, there were some people who willingly went ahead along with it. And definitely those people were bowing down to these bimosios, to these Avodah Zaras over here, and they were using not only the Avodah Zara and the Mashamash Avodah Zara. So therefore, the reason why those things became aser is not because there was a public ones that happened, like you just got finished telling us. Rather, the reason why they become aser is because there was a public desecration of Hashem's name, because there were some Yisrael Mumrim who willingly and happily went along with it, and they bowed down to it. In other words, we're not saying that Rava is wrong. In other words, Rava's teretz still makes sense. We could still be miyashiv, we could still settle our stira, which is, why does our Gemara start off saying that a Avodah Zara only becomes aser if it's served by the person who owns it, and the Brisa says it's talking about a case. The Brisa says it becomes aser even if someone else serves it. So now the answer. Sorry, that was already answered. I'm losing my own train of thought. The answer is it only becomes aser if you serve your own Avodah Zara. What does ones mean? Ones means that I go ahead, someone goes ahead and serves Avodah Zara to their own animal, ba'ones. The problem with that is ones rachmana patre. On that we explained, yes, it's true ones rachmana patre, but that there's a difference between public and private. In public, even though it's an ones, it's still a problem. We tried to back that up by giving this case of bimosios, which happened in public. We said it's not a riot from there because that may not have been an ones, that may have actually been a case where people bow down intentionally. And then Rav Ashi said, no, it's not maybe people bow down intentionally. Certainly people bow down intentionally, because there always were Yisraelim, Mumrim, Rachmana Litzlan, who did this. Chizkiah Amar, Chizkiah says, Kagon, Shenisech Lavos Gechavim. He's going back to this original question. The original question was, how could it be that someone else's Avodah Zara will become Aser as a result of someone else's action? So he says, Shenisech La'avodas Gechavim Yayin Al Karneha. He poured, to, the box says Bein Karneha. So a person went over to the animal and poured wine, did a wine libation to Avodah Zara between the horns of this person's animal. Now, what is he accomplishing? He's accomplishing that the only time we say a person's animal will not become Aser by being served as Avodah Zara is when the only thing that happened was the person bowed down to it. But if an action was actually taken and a physical action happened to the animal, like pouring wine on its head between its horns, in a case like that, Chizkiah is saying that's what will become Aser nevertheless, because something physical happened to it. Now the Gemara says, hold on a second. I understand that the animal got wet because you poured wine on its head between its horns. But ultimately, why would the animal become Aser as a result of that? Maskiv lo Rav Ada bar Ahava, hay nevad. Is that actually serving the animal? You're not serving the animal by pouring wine on its head. Hay nevadhu, hay bimus ba'amahu. Visharya, this is just a simple pedestal. When a person pours wine for Avodah Zara on the head of the animal between its horns, what's the Avodah Zara? Not the animal, some other Avodah Zara. Whatever the person is serving, whether it's a mountain, whether it's a valley, whether it's a tree, whether it's the stars, the moons, or any other kind of structure that the person has, the Avodah Zara is independent. Now the person goes ahead and Rachmana Litzlan serving Avodah Zara, and he says, I'm going to pour a wine libation towards my Avodah Zara, and he pours it on the head of this animal between its horns. The animal is not the Avodah Zara. You can't call the animal nevad as a result of that, to say that the animal will now become forbidden because wine was poured over it. The animal is just a pedestal, just a little item in the way that you're pouring wine over. So why should that make it aser? Hay bimus ba'amahu v'sharya. El amar v'ada barahava kagon shenisech lo yayin bein karneha. You poured wine for it between its horns. The avad ba maisa. You actually did a maisa on the animal. You served the actual animal. V'chihada asa ula. Amar Rav Yochanan, and similar to what Rav Ula said. He brought this information from Rabbi Yochanan, which is lo asra, even though we learned that a person does not have the ability to make his friend's animal forbidden because he bowed down to it. That's only when he bows down to it. However, asaba maisa, if he actually does a physical action to the animal actually feels the physical result of you serving the animal as Avodah Zara. In such a case, Asra, the animal does become Asra. So how do we have a case where a person serves his friend's animal and his friend's animal becomes Asra? That happens if a person does a physical action to the animal. Amar lahu Rabbi Nachman. Nachman said, Paku, we're going to go out. We have exactly the same thing that Rav Huna actually explained your teaching in Bavel. In other words, we could second this or back this up. The Amar of Huna, a person's friend's animal was crouched down in front of Avodah Zara. Now, kivun sheshachat basimin echad, if a person goes ahead to that animal that's crouching down and he slaughters even one of the simanim in its neck, asra, becomes asra. Suminala and the asra. How do you know it becomes asra? Ilim kohanim. If you can tell me from the kohanim that served, they became disqualified. Well, Dilmashani Kohanim, Dibnei Deya Ninu. Maybe Kohanim are different because Kohanim, they have brains, and therefore what they do, they are responsible for, and that's why they became disqualified. They're not allowed to go ahead and serve inside the Beis HaMikdash anymore. The Elami Avnei Mizbeach, and most people learn this from the Avnei Mizbeach. Again, we kind of went through this yesterday already. Maybe the reason why the Avnei Mizbeach, the stones in the Mizbeach, are going to be disqualified is like Rav Papa. If you look at Rashi in the bottom, what is that talking about? And if you look at the second, let's look at the last two Rashis. We learned this, that the Malchi Beis Chashmonai went and they buried the stones. Mishum the Shiktzum Malchi Yavan Lavos Kechavim. The Malchi Yavan, the Greeks went ahead and they made those stones disgusting with Avoda Zara. V'afa gav the hektish havi v'lo havi. And even though it didn't belong to them, nevertheless, we see clearly, even though these stones did not belong to these Greeks, they had no ability to ask for something that doesn't belong to them. Nevertheless, when the Malchus Beis Chashmonai went ahead and they hid the stones of that Mizbeach. Gemara says, no. You can't prove from there that you have the ability to ask for someone else's item as Avoda Zara just because of that story. What's Rapapa? Look at Rashi again. In other words, in that case, there was a pasuk that we had where he's able to say, oh, there's a pasuk that said that he can't use these stones over again. Maybe that's different. The Gemara says, Ella, Mikalim. We must be learning from the Kalim, from the vessels, top of Nundaladam and Bays. The Siv, where it says in the Pasuk, Veskola Kalim, we had this also. Veskola Kalim, Asher his Niach Hamelach Achos b'Malchuso, b'Malu Heichenu v'Hiktashnu. V'Amar Mar, as we learned, V'Amar Heichenu, in other words, Sheganzum, they hid the Kalim, they hid the vessels that were used. The hikdashnu, shikdashnu acherim tachteim. They went ahead and they consecrated and they designated new kalim in their place. So we see clearly that they were concerned about the kalim that were used. That our Gemara just explains, the Gemara just articulates the whole thing. Shikdashnu, shikdashnu acherim tachteim. Now the Gemara asks, v'ha'ein adam osu davar she'eino shelo. You can't go ahead and aser vessels that don't belong to you. These vessels did not belong to these people. So how is it that they were able to go ahead and make them aser? Gemara says, El kiven de avad behu maisa, since an action was taken in the service of Avodah Zara with these items, it's rulahu. They became aser. So hanami, in our case as well, kiven she'asa b'maisa asra. Once an action was taken in them, it does become aser. So again, just to wrap this up, of course, a person does not have the ability to go to ask for someone else's item. So if a person bows down to someone else's animal, Rachmana litzlan, the halacha is that person's animal remains permissible, does not become aser. However, if a person does something physical to someone else's item, they do have the ability to be able to ruin it. In other words, this kind of follows typical rules. In other words, the person might not have the right to do it, but once something physical happens, it's the reality. It happened. And since it happened, and now responsible for the damage that they caused, and Avodah Zara is considered damage, and the animal now becomes prohibited. Yasser of Dimi Om Rabbi Yochanan. When Rav Dimi came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Afa Pisha Amram Mishtach Karka Olam Lo Asra. Even though we learn the person bows down to the ground, to the earth, Lo Asra Chafar Baboros Sichin or Shichin Ma'aros. The person goes ahead and digs these cisterns, little pits in the ground, or little caves, then it does become us. In other words, if a person digs these little trenches into the ground with the intention of Avodah Zara, then it becomes asur. Because again, a person bowing down to the ground essentially does nothing to the ground. It's his own problem that he's doing that. However, the ground does not become subject to Avodah Zara. However, if he goes ahead and actually does a physical action, he takes physical action to the ground, then indeed it will have an effect, it becomes asur. Ki asa Rav Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan, he said, Afal pisha amru mishtach vel ba'alei chayim. Even though we learned that a person bows down to live animals, lo asran, if it does not become asr. However, asa chalipin lavodos kochavim asra. If a person makes a switch, he swaps his one animal for the next, so with the original one being Avodah Zara, it does become asr. Now, ki asa Ravin, when Ravin came, Amar pligu ba Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanan. There's machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan on this matter. Chad Amar, one says chalipin asurin, the original swapped item or animal becomes asur. However, chalipin, the third generation, mutarin. It's going to be mutar. The Chad Amar, one of them says afilu chalipin, even the third generation is nami asur, is going to be us. In other words, the question is, how many switches down the line does Avodah Zarah have the ability to impact? So he starts off by saying, even though we're saying that a person bows down to someone else's animal, that can't make it asur. However, if a person makes a swap, and if the original Avodah Zarah is switched for another one, then it becomes a problem. Rashi, the way he describes this is chalipin, it's right before the lines get skinny. Hechlifin ba'avodas kechavim. In other words, shahaisalai avodas kechavim. He had his own Avodah Zarah. V'chlifa l'ovid kechavim b'behemto. He switched it for his animal. So let's just say a person has this idol. He says, you know what? He wants to switch it. I'll make a trade for the person's cow. So now what happens is the cow now becomes asur Avodah Zarah. The question we're having is, what happens if he now switches the cow for another cow? Does it now transfer to the third one? So Gemara says, "My time at the Amar Chalipin Asurin." What would be the reason why there would be third generation problems when it comes to switching twice? So he says, "Amar Kra." The pasuk says again in this week's parsha, Parshas Eikev. It says, "Shaketz tishaksenim sa'et savenu," and it says. No, I read it out of order. It says, "Lo savi se'evel b'sacha v'yisacherem kamayu shaketz tishaksenim v'yisacherem kamayu." The pasuk says, "V'yisa cherem kamahu." It shall be with you like a cherem. Now, kol sha'ata mehaya, the word of v'yisa says, anything kol sha'ata mehaya mimenu harehu kamahu. Anything, I guess the word would probably would be to facilitate. Anything that you could facilitate as a result of this original Avodah Zarah will retain its Avodah Zarah status. So, if the original change started, the original swap started with an Avodah Zarah, and then you got an animal as a result of that Avodah Zarah, and then you switch that animal for another animal, since it all came from the power of the original Avodah Zarah, it holds on to its Avodah Zarah status. V'idach, the other opinion that says it goes only one generation of switch, but not two generations. Amar Kar, the pasuk says, "Who?" It says at the end, "Ki cherem who v'lo chalipe chalipin." The original switch holds on to it, but not a second generation switch. V'idach, how about the other opinion that says that it does go two generations? Hahumi bayile, that word "who" is necessary to teach us l'me'ute arla v'klaya karem. To go ahead and to exclude a case of arla and klaya karim, both arla and klaya karim. So arla is fruits that grew within the first 3 years of the tree's life, they're not allowed to be consumed. Klaya karim is fruits that grew in a vineyard, klayim in a vineyard, where a person mixed together grains inside a vineyard. So those, whatever grows over there is going to be forbidden. She'im machran, if a person sold either the arla or the klayim, the kidesh b'demeim. He married a woman with its money. So he goes ahead, he sells the arla, he sells the klayim, he makes the money, and he walks over to a woman and says, "Areyeh mikudeshes li," with this money. What's the halacha? Mikudeshes. Shall be mikudeshes. In other words, what he's saying is that even though it was swapped from arla or swapped from klayim, it's not gonna retain its prohibited status. In other words, the prohibited status only is true when it comes to Avodah Zarah. When it comes to Avodah Zarah, that holds on to its status when you make the switch, but not when you swap out arla or klaya karim. So the other opinion, v'idach arlo klaya karim lo tzrichi miuta. You don't need to have a pasuk to go ahead and tell you that the swap is not going to hold on to there. Why? What he says is that anytime you have two psukim teaching us exactly the same thing, and it's specifically talking about one case, what that means is, you know why the Torah repeated it? The Torah repeated it to tell you that it's only true in these two cases. So therefore, we have a pasuk which tells us, Lo savi so'evel b'secha v'yisacherem kamahu. That tells us that the Avodah Zarah status is retained even after you switch it. And now we have another pasuk which says exactly the same thing when it comes to the fruits of Shemitah, that its status of Kedushas Shvius stays with it even when it's swapped. That means if you have a pasuk specifically saying the halacha about Avoda Zara, and you have a pasuk specifically saying the halacha about Shvius, that means these halachas are only true about Avoda Zara and Shemitah, and not true in other cases, such as Arla, fruits of the first 3 years, or Klai Karam. Klai Karam is when you mix together forbidden mixtures inside the vineyard. Now, Avoda Zara, Avos Kochavim Hodamaran. We already mentioned the pasuk of Avoda Zara. Shvius, where is the pasuk that tells us that Shemitah holds on to its kedusha status even after a switch to Chsiv? For it says in the pasuk, Ki Yovel hi Kodesh Tiyalachem. It's going to be Yovel, the Jubilee year. Kodesh Tiyalachem, everything shall be sanctified. Ma Kodesh Tofes es Damav, just like something which is Kodesh, something which is hektish, which is consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash, Tofes es Damav, V'asar af Shvius, similarly Shvius, Tofes es Damea, V'asura. It's going to hold on to the value of its money, and it's going to be asur even if you swap it. Now the Gemara says, hold on. Ima Kodesh, if that's the way you're learning it, then Kodesh is different. Why? Because Kodesh is Tofes es Damav, V'yotza l'chulin. It holds on to its money, but ultimately it goes out to chulin. In other words, the original item could be redeemed. When it comes to Shvius, you're learning it from hektish. Hektish is something which can be redeemed. So it seems like you're saying Shvius should be redeemed also. And the verse says no. It will remain with its kedusha. Haketzad, how does this work? The way it works is as follows. Lakach peros Shvius. Lakach paperos Shvius basar. A person goes ahead and takes fruit that grew during the 7th year of Shemitah, and he goes ahead and he barters them for a piece of meat. So he switches them for a piece of meat. Now the halacha is both the peros Shvius and the meat, elu ve'elu, misbarim b'shvius. They retain the halacha of Shvius. When it comes to the Zman Biur, they have to be burned. The halacha is when it comes to Shvius, to Shemitah, once there's no more fruits left in the field, that's the time you have to stop eating all fruit of Shvius. If you did not finish it yet, it has to be burned. So if a person buys a piece of meat with these fruits of Shvius, then if it reaches the Zman Biur, the time when he has to get rid of all the fruit of Shemitah, then guess what? He has to burn his fruit and his piece of meat. Now what happens if Lokach bebasar dagim, he switched in his piece of meat for a piece of fish? Halacha is yatsa basar. Now the meat loses its status as kedusha shvius, and nichnasu dagim. Now the fish take its place. Now what happens if bedagim yayin? He switched the fish, so he switched in a bowl of herring for a glass of wine. Now what happens is Yatsu dagim, the fish now lose its status as Shemitah, and nichnas yayin, now the wine takes over. What happens if biyayin shemen, he switches the glass of wine for oil, Yatsu yayin, v'nichnas shemen. The wine loses its status as Shvius, and the oil takes its place. Paketzad, so how does this work? Achron nitpas b'Shvius, the last one holds onto the Shvius, to the Shemitah category, Priatmo, and the actual fruit itself also also retains its status. So in other words, the bottom line is, we got finished saying was, the previous Mount Amar needed to learn the pasuk of Hu to exclude Arla and Shvius. This Mount Amar doesn't need it because he says it's Shnei Ksivim Ba'in Ke'achad, Be'im, therefore it automatically would be, the Arla and Klai Karam would be excluded. Now V'idach Kasava Shnei Ksivim Ba'in Ke'achad Melamdim, V'tzichu L'mutinu. He is not impressed by this gzera. In other words, he says it's very often we're going to have two psukim teaching us the same thing, and therefore Shnei Ksivim Ba'in Ke'achad, two psukim teaching exactly the same halacha in different cases. It's possible that they can both have the same halacha, and it still will teach us about a third halacha, which in this case would be Arla and Shvius, and therefore he needs the word Hu to go ahead and to exclude it. So again, ultimately we have a machlokas whether third generation swaps of Avoda Zara hold on to the Avoda Zara status, or if a third generation swap does not hold on to it, and it's dependent on how you darshan the pasuk of V'losavi to'eva el vosecha el beisecha v'yisacherim k'mohu shaketz t'shaktzenu v'sa'etz t'venu kicherim hu. Are you going to go ahead and darshan that last word, or not, to exclude Arla and Shvius? Now we start with a little bit of an Agadata Mishnah. An interesting Agadata Mishnah. Shalu es hazakenim baromi.
The sages of Rome were asked the following question. If it's true that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if Hashem does not want Avoda Zara, why can't Hashem just go ahead and destroy it? Amr Lahen, it's important to note that we mentioned earlier one of the svaras as to why Avoda Zara, once it breaks, it's no longer it's no longer Avoda Zara, is because the thought process is, if the Avoda Zara can't protect itself, then why should people serve it? So essentially the question these individuals were asking the Zakenim was, if Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want Avoda Zara, why doesn't he just protect us from it? Destroy all the Avoda Zara. So Amr Lahem, the Zakenim responded to them and said, Ilu l'davar she'ein tzorach l'olam bo hayu ovdin. If people only served Avoda Zara to things the world did not need, yeah, maybe hayu mevatla, Kadosh Baruch Hu would just go ahead and destroy it. The problem is, Areyeh ovdin l'chama, they serve the moon, the sun, v'lalavana, into the moon, v'lakochavim, into the stars, into the mazalos, into the constellations. So what do you mean? Yovad olamu b'pnei hashotim, because of these fools, Kadosh Baruch Hu should go ahead and destroy the whole world that he created. Kadosh Baruch Hu created a beautiful world during Sheshis Yemei Bereshis. Because these people go ahead and make these mistakes, these fools of Kadosh Baruch Hu should take the beautiful Bria and destroy it. Amru Lahan, they said to him, Cain, Yovad davar she'ein tzarach la'olam bo, v'yanech davar she'tzarach la'olam bo. Okay, that's the problem. Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want to destroy the world. Let him destroy at least the things that the world doesn't need. All the inanimate objects that people created and serve. Why does the Kadosh Baruch Hu go ahead and just destroy them? So Amr Lahan, they responded to them and said, Af anu machzikin yidei ovdeim shel elu. What we're going to do by doing that is, we're going to give tremendous amounts of chizik and inspiration to the people who are serving Avodah Zara. She'omrim teidu shehein elohos shaharei hein lobat. They're going to say, I have proof that my Avodah Zara is actually real. Because Rahman al-Islam, imagine this scenario. You have people who are serving the moon, people serving the sun, people serving the stars, people serving the constellations. And then you also have people who are serving bricks and stones and mountains and other types of structures that they built. And then one day Kadosh Baruch Hu says, you know what? I've had enough of all this Avodah Zara. He goes ahead and destroys all of the inanimate objects, things that are not necessary for the function of the world. And then guess what happens? All those people who are serving the sun and the moon, they say, you know what? It was Avodah Zara destruction day, and guess what? Our Avodah Zara survived. It must be that our Avodah Zara is actually real. Yours got destroyed because you were serving a table or a chair or a rock outside. We were serving the moon, the sun. Must be it's real. Therefore, Kadosh Baruch Hu does not get involved. The Gemara goes into this a little bit more. Tan Rabbanon, Sha'alu Philosophim, the philosophers asked, that's Zakenim Baromi, the sages in Rome. The same question. If your God does not want Avodah Zara, why doesn't he just go ahead and destroy it? Amr Lahen, they responded to them and said, if they were serving just random things the world does not need, he would have gone ahead and destroyed it. The problem is, they're serving the sun, the moon, the stars, and the constellations. So Yovad Olam, the world should be destroyed because of these fools. Ella, see, they ended up as follows, which is very important. Ella, Olam, Kimin Hago, Noeg. Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world to follow a certain path. Vishotim shekilkalu, those who went and took that world and destroyed it, asitin litin esadin, they're going to have to ultimately pay for their mistakes. In other words, the Kadosh Baruch Hu is not going to change the world just to accommodate the Rishayim. Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world. He told us how to use the world. He told us how to live in the world. He told us the right way for a person to be able to exist in the world. A person makes choices and decides to do other things. The Kadosh Baruch Hu is not going to change the world for them. But ultimately, yeshtin v'yeshtayin, there'll come a day when they're going to have to pay for it. Davar acher, similarly, Areyeh shegazal sa shachitim. Person goes to someone else's house and he steals a sa'av of wheat. V'halach v'zara b'karka. He went ahead and he planted it in the ground. Now dinhu, by strict justice, shlot yitzamach, it shouldn't grow. Why should it grow? A person doesn't deserve it. It's not his. He doesn't own it. Why should he have a whole field filled with grain? Ella, olon k'minhago noheg. The world works. Kadosh Baruch Hu created nature of the world, and He allows us to use it how He wants. Olam k'minhago noeg v'holech. Now v'shotim shekilkilu, fools who go ahead and destroy the world. Asiti and litin isadin. So a person stole. Now his whole crop ultimately is stolen grains. He goes ahead and takes ownership over it. He sells it. He ultimately is going to have to take responsibility for the fact that his entire wealth was built off of stolen goods. Davar achar, another way of learning this. Harei shabal ishus chavero. If there was an illegitimate relationship that took place between a man and someone else's wife, dinhu, by strict law, shlota sabra, she should not become pregnant from that. Kadosh Baruch Hu is not interested in seeing children from this kind of relationship. Ella, olam k'minago noeg v'holech. Kadosh Baruch Hu created a certain nature to the world, and people have the ability to make good choices or poor choices. People make bad choices. Fools go ahead and they make bad choices. Yes, Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to allow the result of their actions to reach fruition, but ultimately they're going to have to pay for their poor choices. Behind the Amar Rish Lakish, this is what Rish Lakish meant when he said, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Lo dayin l'rishayim is not enough for these evil people. Shosin sela shali pumbi. They freely stamp my image, which is a way of saying every single person who's created is a telam elokim. So every single individual who's created is essentially a stamp of the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They force me, so to speak, for me to go ahead and to stamp my image onto people who shouldn't really exist. People who are born out of these kinds of relationships, out of znus, the man going ahead and engaging with an Eishes Ish, with a married woman, and then she gives birth to ultimately to a mamzer. Kadosh Baruch Hu is not excited to bring a child like that into this world. But you know what? There's a nature that's created. We have to make good choices. If we make good choices, we have good results of those choices. If Rahman al-Islam people make bad choices, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, kind of my hands are tied, but ultimately that's the way it created the world. Now, it's interesting, Rashi says over here, look at Rashi. I'm going to create the child, I'll form the child, and cause it to be born. Why? It is a gzera, it's a decree that was passed, that the world takes a certain course. Rashi says, where did he get this from? Where does this pasuk come from? Shakadosh Baruch Hu kavol akach. He says with Tanchuma Darash, may also pasuk Tzor Yilad Chateshi. It's a pasuk in Hazinu. The Tzor Yilad Chateshi. Vatishkak El Mechalalecha, right? So in other words, it means Tzor Yilad Chateshi. Hakadosh Baruch Hu is like the rock that creates, but again, it's kind of against His will to be able to do that. Now, Sha'alu Falufis Achas. A philosopher asked a question, asked Rabbi Gamliel. He asked the following question to Rabbi Gamliel. Kasam b'Torah. The Torah says in it, Ki Hashem Elokecha Eish Al-Chala, Kadosh Baruch Hu consumes fire. Who? Kelkana. He is a Lord of vengeance. So he says, Why is the Kadosh Baruch Hu taking revenge against those who serve Avoda Zara, not against the actual Avoda Zara itself? A similar question to what we had over here. People are serving Avoda Zara, Kadosh Baruch Hu takes out his vengeance against them, but not against the actual Avoda Zara. I'll give you a parable. What is this similar to? To a king, he had one son, but also a ben, lo as a kelev. The son was raising a dog. Sorry. The son names his dog the same name as his father, the king. When he goes ahead and he swears, the son, Amar lo b'chayi kelev abba. He says, I'm taking a shua in the name, and he says his dog's name. My dog's name, he says his father's name. So now his Abba Kishama Melech, when the dog hears that he is referring to his dog by his father's name, Amiyu Koes. Who does he get angry at? Alabenu Koes. Does he get angry at his son? Oh, Ala Kelev Koes. Does he get angry at the dog? What's the answer? Havi Omer Alaban. The dog didn't do anything wrong. The dog doesn't care what its name is. He didn't name himself. It's the son who gave him this name. So Amar Lo, in other words, his response was the Kadosh Baruch Hu is not going to get upset at the Avoda Zara. The Avoda Zara is an inanimate object. It didn't do anything. Some person went ahead and designated that as their deity. So Kadosh Baruch Hu gets upset at the servers of Avoda Zara, but not at the Avoda Zara itself. So he responded, this philosopher said, what? Amar Lo kelavat the koriosa. You're referring to my Avoda Zara as a dog. I can't believe it. Hello yesh ba mamish. Avoda Zara is something which has substance to it. It really works. Amar Lo, he said to Mari Isa, what did you see about your Avoda Zara that convinced you that it really works? Amar Lo, he said to him, Pam achas naflot dleika be'irenu. One time there was a fire in our city. The nitshufa kol kula. The entire city got burned down. Also based on Avodas Kachavim, lo nisraf. Miraculous. This Avoda Zara house did not get burned. It must be. It's because the Avoda Zara was protecting itself. Amar Lo, he said to him, Em shalacha mashal. Let me give you another parable. L'mad of Radoma, l'melech bas v'dam shesarach al-Medina. There was a king who got angry. Sorry, shesarcha alav Medina. That one of his cities rebelled against him. When the king goes ahead to wage a battle against those who are rebelling against him, who does he wage a battle against? The live people in the city or the dead people in the cemetery of the city? I would say, it's with the live people that he wages war. Again, the Avoda Zara is like dead. It's like a bunch of dead people. It's inanimate. It doesn't move. So he said to him, what? I'm really kelavat the koriosa. First you call me Avoda Zara a dog. And now Mesa to koriosa. Now you're calling it dead. So it's nothing worse than being a dead dog. And so he says, in Cain, you have denim in the olam. If that's the case, the Kadosh Baruch Hu should go ahead and just destroy the Avoda Zara. If you're calling it a dead dog, let him just destroy it. He said to him, if the world didn't need these things, and those were the things of them people served, Areyeh Kadosh Baruch Hu would destroy it. The problem is Areyeh and Ovdum L'chama, they serve the sun, Avoda and the moon, L'kochavim and the stars, the Mazelos, and to the constellations, L'afikim L'geos, into valleys, into springs. So Yovad alone, Shotim, Kadosh Baruch Hu should go ahead and destroy the world because of these fools. Chenu Omer, the pasuk says, Asof, top of Nenhei Amar Aleph, Asof, Asaf, Kol Ma, Pnei Ha'adaman Hashem. Asof, Adum, Behema, would Hashem want to go ahead and gather people and animals? Asaf, for Shemayim, Kadosh Baruch Hu go ahead and gather all the birds of Shemayim with the Ge'ayam and all the fish inside the water, and anything that goes ahead and causes Rishayim to stumble. Nesher Rishayim, Nechshalim, Yovdem, and Olam. We should go ahead and destroy the whole world because Rishayim go ahead and serve these things. People even there are people who even serve other people. So what if Yichrati Adam Adama should go ahead and destroy people? In other words, the message is that Kadosh Baruch Hu gives us a beautiful world. Kadosh Baruch Hu gives us many opportunities. Every opportunity in life is also a responsibility. So Gemara is teaching us something very important. Kadosh Baruch Hu is not going to hold our hand and force us to do the right thing. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells us what the right thing to do is. He created a beautiful world with tremendous opportunities and tremendous responsibilities. It's our responsibility to look around the world and to recognize what our responsibilities are, what are our opportunities. We can't go ahead and misuse our opportunities, and if we do, don't expect a magic hand from heaven to come down and to save us. It's not the way Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world. It's our responsibility to live lives that are upstanding, good lives, and if we make those mistakes, it's going to be our problem to fix it. We can't just say Kadosh Baruch Hu will go down. So people serving Avoda Zara, all Avoda Zara will be destroyed. Mirz Hashem, we should be zacha to always make good choices, and Kadosh Baruch Hu should be able to give us that siyat d'shmaya. Have a wonderful rest of your day.